Sorry, can you put your drink on a coaster? I know, I'm just really OCD about this stuff. Like, oh my God, yeah, I love when my desk is all organized before I start work, and I always use hand sanitizer after traveling on the tube. I know it's so weird. If you ask most people to describe OCD, the image in their heads would almost certainly be of someone similar to this: a neat freak. Someone who washes their hands a lot, meticulously aligning their pens on their desk so they're perfectly parallel. This is, in large part, due to the representation that we've seen of the condition on screen. Characters with canonical OCD, like Emma Pillsbury in Glee, or those described as being OCD, like Monica in Friends. This, in turn, leads to an exaggerated, oh my God, I'm so OCD, language in everyday life to describe behaviours that match with these types of characters. They have type A personalities, are kind of annoying, and their OCD emerges often as a humorous moment of finicky perfectionism. They don't understand why these dirty, messy idiots around them don't get their totally understandable quirks. And when you look at the medium that they're a part of, film and TV, it makes total sense, right? That this is how OCD has been portrayed. By its very nature, audiovisual mediums give us a literal look at a character's external behaviours, but for the most part, we can't see inside a character's head in the way that we can when we're reading a novel, say. And as I'll dive into later in this video, what is going on inside someone with OCD's head is essential to understanding their lived experience. But because it most often has to be externally shown in film and TV, the hand washing and organisation is an easy visual action an audience can understand. It's also a reasonably palatable visual. It might not be entirely logical, but it is a morally neutral act to wash your hands or organise objects in front of you. Even if the character talks aloud about their internal thoughts of perfectionism or fear of contamination and disease, it's linked to existing and understandable fears for the general public. Most people can understand not wanting things to be dirty or not wanting to get sick, for example. It might be seen as over the top or strange, but not necessarily something that should involve a moral judgment. These actions are unlikely to cause harm or offence to others, and in a lot of this representation, it also doesn't really seem to do any harm to the person themselves either. The cycle of representation has undoubtedly enforced this view, meaning that new writers and filmmakers know that if they want a quick show-don't-tell shorthand for OCD, they make their character paranoid about germs, have them wipe down surfaces around them with more intensity than usual, that kind of thing. This is especially true for ensemble shows, procedurals, and the like, where it's not likely that you'll have a stylistic aspect that will let a character's inner monologue be heard like a voiceover, especially not a side character or a one-off guest role. The most common depiction of OCD we see on our screen is, in a word, palatable. It is, ironically enough, sanitized. But if an audience could hear the inner monologue of my earliest memory from when I was around 5 years old, it might have sounded something more like this. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, hurt. Pain hurt. My teddy bear hasn't. She's going to. She's going to. There's my teddy bear hasn't. She's going to. 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 So let's talk about the reality of OCD, what it looks like beyond the stereotypes, by breaking down what it actually is, exploring some lesser seen representation of the condition, as well as asking how we might go about having open discussions about conditions like this that often revolve around unspeakable and shameful thoughts. What is OCD? If we look beyond the characters to the science of it all, a very different picture emerges about this psychological condition that is estimated to affect tens of millions of people worldwide. In the most simple terms, OCD is defined as a disorder in which people have recurring unwanted thoughts, ideas, or sensations, obsessions. To get rid of the thoughts, they feel driven to do something repetitively, compulsions. The repetitive behaviours such as hand washing, cleaning, checking on things, and mental acts like counting or other activities can significantly interfere with a person's daily activities and social interactions. This can look different from person to person and can even change for an individual over their lifetime. There's no set formula for what OCD looks like and how it's enacted. Some of my earliest memories were these uncontrollable and recurring thoughts. It was distressing because at that age, you already have difficulty separating reality and fiction. After all, it's a period of life with imaginary and make-believe friends. Most kids are only dealing with the outside world and all the expected uncertainties of growing up. But for me, and for many people with OCD, we're battling a whole world inside our own heads, more uncertain and tenuous. As a child with a big, vivid imagination and who has a constant internal monologue going on, the lines between reality and my head would blur, and intrusive thoughts, an image or idea would come into my mind and I couldn't get rid of it. An image that appears seemingly out of nowhere and won't go away is, to a child, just what reality is. It's the strange and new world around them that they're experiencing for the first time. So when I lay in my bed in the dark, had the sudden image of my favourite stuffed bear holding a knife, and a voice in my head started saying that she was going to try and stab me with it, that was terrifying. I couldn't get rid of the thought, and in my child brain that correlated with things that were real in the world. My earliest memory of my teddy bear trying to kill me is one I experienced as if it really happened, because that is the only way that my brain can make sense of an image, an idea that came into my head outside of my control and wouldn't go away. When thoughts like this happened, I don't know why or how, but my brain started to do what millions of other OCD riddled brains have done over the centuries, and that was basically to make a bargain with itself. A bargain that was out of my control. The danger was real, but I could keep it at bay. If only I did this one thing, or kept thinking this one thought, maybe counting or repeating a safe phrase over and over internally. It may seem strange to many people, I'm sure, to have aspects of your brain create their own strange logic without your input or permission. That's a central aspect of OCD, a lack of power over your own thoughts. I was first diagnosed as a teenager when I snuck out during a double-free period to go to the doctors for an assessment. It was pretty immediately apparent that I had OCD, although my obsessions and compulsions had morphed and changed over the years. I still have, what's called pure OCD, which I'll go into more detail on in a bit, but my compulsions are mainly internal, having to think certain things, needing to count in my head. I very much have OCD, but I've never had the urge to clean or tidy because of it. In fact, I'm notoriously messy, constantly losing things and forgetting to do my laundry or dishes. And I definitely have some additional interacting conditions, specifically anxiety and depression and seasonal affective disorder, but they weren't diagnosed until after my OCD was confirmed. My ADHD diagnosis a few years ago completed the psychological profile, I guess, and all these things definitely cross over and affect each other. The anxiety could jumpstart an OCD spiral. The depression could make my OCD obsessions straight into the increasingly morbid. My ADHD meant that I was hyper aware of OCD triggers around me. My diagnosis, though, only came about because of extensive research on my part to figure out what the hell was wrong with me. I knew that something had to be wrong. Whatever was going on in my head was causing me intense distress. I just didn't know what it was. In fact, a big part of living with OCD that typical representations often fail to show is the physical and emotional toll that can impact our daily lives. Broadly, physical symptoms might include tension headaches, muscle aches, fatigue, sleep disturbance, gastrointestinal issues, and skin irritation. Behavioral therapists emphasize that these physical symptoms are linked to the psychological distress caused by OCD, and not to any underlying medical condition alongside it. Emotional impacts can result in feelings of anxiety, fear, guilt, shame, and distress due to obsessions and compulsions, leading some people to become frustrated, irritable, withdrawn, which can lead to strained relationships and a diminished overall quality of life because of how exhausting and mentally consuming it all is. For me, the internet was an invaluable resource, a place you could search symptoms and experiences that you maybe didn't feel able to tell those around you about. You want to make sure that you're crazy before you tell people that you think you're crazy. My friends definitely knew something was wrong though. It was hard to spend time with me and not notice my usual hyperactive talkative self go suddenly quiet as I got lost in compulsions in my own head. They helped me make the appointment and took me to the doctor's surgery and were a judgment-free sounding board to talk about a lot of the things that I was thinking. But I didn't tell them all of it. Even these open-minded, accepting, generous people, because there was still so much shame there about what exactly my brain was making me think. It wasn't that I worried that they think I was crazy, I was worried that they think I was a horrible person. The obsessions. Obsessions in OCD are recurrent and persistent thoughts, impulses, or images that cause distressing emotions like anxiety, fear, or disgust, and may interfere with daily life and functioning. I think the word obsession can conjure up images of a fan, someone with an excited and active relationship with something. But with OCD, it's important to understand that the term obsession, it's very different. Obsessions are both involuntary, meaning that they can't be helped, and unwelcome. In fact, efforts to suppress obsessions generally fail and paradoxically increase obsessive ideation. This phenomenon is referred to as the thought suppression paradox. Obsessions can come in many forms, but some common examples of obsessional thoughts include fear of contamination, probably the most common representation of OCD to the general public, but also disturbing sexual thoughts or images, religious, often blasphemous thoughts or fears, fear of perpetrating aggression or being harmed, self or loved ones, extreme worry something is not complete, extreme concern with order, symmetry or precision, fear of losing or discarding something important, and can also be seemingly meaningless thoughts, images, sounds, words, or music. I really want to emphasize something here. These thoughts are, by their nature, unwanted and distressing. These are not thoughts that come naturally to someone with OCD by being in line with their moral beliefs or desired worldview or natural personality. Often it is not just the thoughts themselves, but the fact that they are thinking them at all that can cause distress. For example, the mental image of violence is itself upsetting, but the fact that you are thinking about doing violence, however unwanted, is also upsetting in and of itself. These initial obsessive thoughts might not themselves feel dangerous or fear-inducing, but our minds may well provide an extreme spiraling endpoint that does. Sometimes it's a specific thing, like a fear that losing your keys will result in being locked out of your flat, which will result in you not being able to get inside to find the electrical fire that will consume everything that you own. Other times, it's a more nebulous, inescapable feeling of dread that something bad will happen. Many of us living with OCD, we recognize that these are products of our own imagination and mind, that they're unreasonable or untrue, but ultimately these thoughts simply can't be solved through logic or reasoning. You can tell yourself that everything will be okay, that it's your mind playing tricks on you, but the feeling remains, and so we try and ease our distress through compulsive behaviors or distracting ourselves in other ways. One researcher, William Gordon, writes that obsessions are often posed as hypotheticals. What if I am a homosexual? What if Susan is a slut? By definition, the likelihood of an obsession coming true is remote. However, since they're formulated as hypotheticals, they can never be disproved. Objective feedback that seems to contradict the obsession, e.g. negative results from an AIDS test, can be discounted because it lacks absolute certainty. The quest to prove the unprovable can lead to endless doubt, reassurance seeking, and the performance of magical compulsions. For someone with OCD, no level of statistical significance is ever low enough to dismiss the null hypothesis. 100% certainty is demanded. The distress is heightened precisely because these are thoughts or images that you wouldn't consciously think. Often they're some of the most awful things that you could think of someone doing. For example, there are parents with intrusive thoughts of hurting their children. There are victims of sexual assault who are plagued with mental images of doing that same thing to others that they care about. But these obsessions are fundamentally antithetical to that person's beliefs and self. That is where the distress comes from. Gordon also notes that obsessions tend to make the sacred profane. Whatever is most important and cherished gets transformed into its opposite, producing ego-dystonic, blasphemous obsessions. One of the few pieces of OCD representation on screen that acknowledges this wide array of presentations is a Spanish comedy film called Tok Tok that gives us a whole ensemble of characters with OCD as its central premise. The story follows a group of patients who all arrive at a doctor's practice at the same time for their respective appointments after they're accidentally given the same session time. Each of them has different clashing personalities, but also different manifestations of OCD. Blanca has contamination-style OCD, Anna Maria has religious obsessions, Emilio has arithmomania, needing to constantly be counting objects and actions. Otto is primarily concerned with symmetry, organization, and avoiding stepping on lines, while Lily repeats words and sounds over and over. In this way, we can see how some of these manifestations will in turn run parallel to or even trigger the others. If one person in a room has a compulsion to reorganize and another has intrusive thoughts telling them that other people's touch is a source of contamination, that will inevitably clash. In the movie, of course, being a comedy, everything works out in the end. They realize that in moments of apparent crisis, while they waited for the doctor to come and decide which of them was there at the correct time, they'd actually helped each other by pushing through their compulsions and rules, creating a kind of group therapy session. And the movie concludes with them agreeing to meet up to run similar exercises on a regular basis to help support each other. It's not a look at a realistic treatment plan, but it's also not meant to be. For all its status as a fun comedy movie, it does treat its characters as people who don't deserve judgment. There's a humor in seeing these people interact, but them being able to challenge and overcome their compulsions is given narrative weight and importance, not seen as a plot device or easy task to be cured by the end of the film. My own obsessions over the years have taken a range of forms: death and destruction, pain, an inescapable sense of impending and certain doom. They can come at any time. As soon as I woke up, during a school exam, hanging out with friends, eating dinner with my family, and suddenly my brain was telling me that the only way to stop these things happening was to give in to the compulsions. I knew once I wasn't a young child that these things weren't real. My thoughts couldn't cause an imminent car crash or the death of a loved one or the shadow of suffering to descend. But that didn't matter. I still had to enact my mental compulsions anyway. As I grew older, into senior school and teenagehood, I solidified a sense of self. I knew what I enjoyed and what I cared about. I was a writer, I loved to cook and bake, I wanted to be an actor. I was also extremely into social and environmental justice. I was the class charity rep every year from year 7 to year 13. I would get into heated debates during religious studies and philosophy and ethics class with the girls who spouted prejudiced talking points. Before I knew I was queer, I was heading up LGBTQ+ related protests and campaigns in our school to try and make the space safer for those who might be part of that community. Then, I turned out to be a lesbian, so that was doubled down on. There is nothing OCD loves more than someone with a strong sense of self, someone with a clear idea of their own moral principles, whatever they might be. Because OCD is fundamentally something that causes distress, and nothing can cause people more genuine psychological pain than being trapped with the ghost of their own voice, tumbling over and over with thoughts that are the antithesis of everything they know themselves to be. My OCD has manifested for a number of years now as the idea that people around me can hear my thoughts. As soon as that pops into my brain, it starts running through a litany of intrusive thoughts that cover pretty much everything that I don't believe. Sexist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, or racist phrases. Judgment that I've had shouted at me before, that my friends have had shouted at them, playing over and over in my own voice internally. Now, I know logically that people cannot hear my thoughts. That in reality, when these horrible intrusive thoughts appear, they are affecting only me. But that logical knowledge is not enough. I'm honestly weirdly grateful that I already had OCD and understood a bit about it by the time this particular obsessive thought cycle appeared, because I knew where it was coming from. I think if it had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, as it can with some people, without the knowledge that OCD feeds on causing distress specifically by utilizing intrusive thoughts that would never normally be something you'd organically think up, that could have severely fucked me up. One of the only representations of OCD that digs into the more taboo side of obsessions is the British show Pure, about a woman with extreme sexual intrusive thoughts. One of the interesting things about this portrayal is how it acknowledges the lack of knowledge around OCD that exists. This isn't a doctor surrounded by well-meaning and knowledgeable peers, or someone already diagnosed with the story begins, or a woman displaying the typical signs of obsessive cleanliness that those around her can spot. Instead, it shows us a woman who doesn't know she has OCD, in part because of lack of representation and education around it for the general public. It doesn't manifest how she's told that it's supposed to. She assumes instead that she has some form of sex addiction, until someone else in the therapy group that she's in suggests that, in fact, she might have OCD. Her obsessive thoughts are shown on screen in these erratic visual flashes, and right from the start of the show, we, the audience, are let into her internal world with a stylized voiceover. In one of the earlier scenes of the show, she stands up to give a speech, and she sees in front of her images of the onlookers in the crowd panting, her friend going down on her dad, even she herself making out with her own mother. We also see the mental toll that it takes on her, the way that it overwhelms her, and the disgust and confusion that she feels. The show's narration, as a direct address to the audience, allows her to verbalize what she's thinking and how she contextualizes it. We aren't relying just on external behaviors or what words she's willing to say out loud to others, which is especially important for a manifestation of OCD, which can fill so many people with shame that they don't want to open up to other people about it. The show originally aired a number of journalists compiled reviews from viewers with OCD to measure their reactions to this new representation. The results were really interesting. Some were adamant that it didn't go far enough. You can see she's disoriented, but it doesn't show the rock bottom distress, not knowing how you're going to carry on living your life with these thoughts in your mind. To me, harming children is the very worst thing you could do. Imagine having that in your head all the time without being able to turn it off. In the show, Marnie has moved to London and she's out socialising. I spent a lot of my youth lost. I wanted to be a primary school teacher, but obviously the idea went out the window. I used to try and shut myself up. I just wanted to feel normal. I wanted to be like everyone else. I remember banging my head against the walls sometimes trying to make it stop. You don't get any of that in Pure. Marnie's intrusive thoughts just dissipate, like miniature hallucinations, and she carries on with life. There's no single experience of OCD, but one of the hallmarks of intrusive thoughts is how long-lasting they are. It's what makes them different from the unwanted thoughts everyone has. Mine are like a story I have to keep repeating to prevent catastrophe. Before I got treatment, I could spend hours reseating passengers in imaginary plane crashes to lower the body count. It was incredibly time-consuming. But other people seem to have got the opposite from the same show. Intrusive thoughts caused by OCD can take control over someone's life, but I don't think it's quite as chaotic as what Marnie deals with. No spoilers, but some scenes are very difficult to watch because they're quite over the top. To me, this is a clear indication of a severe lack of representation available, that everyone's clamoring for this one show to have to reflect their specific experiences, because they don't have alternatives that would allow for a range of representation across multiple characters, genres, and writers. So at this point in the video, I was going to go through other common groupings of OCD obsessions, but we genuinely couldn't be sure that they wouldn't get this video flagged. I want to just let that sink in for a second. The intrusive and repetitive thoughts that are plaguing these people's minds that they are struggling to escape fall into the types of content that are not allowed on YouTube. I'm hoping that listing some of YouTube's policies will allow you to fill in the blanks here of the type of obsessive thoughts that we're talking about. When I looked into what type of content would get this video flagged or demonetized, here were some of the quotes. Content that may upset, disgust, or shock viewers. Harmful or dangerous acts resulting in serious physical, emotional, or psychological injury. Content focused on the abuse or misuse of firearms. Controversial issues including child abuse, adult sexual abuse, sexual harassment, self-harm, suicide, eating disorders, domestic abuse, abortion, and euthanasia. And now for a quick ad from today's sponsor, Headspace. So I've previously used guided meditation and visualization to help with my chronic nausea, but for a long time I sort of assumed that it was just like fine for this bodily thing I was experiencing, but that meditation for the mind probably wasn't for me. Like, I got ADHD and OCD, baby. I am not going to be able to clear my mind and think of nothing. But turns out that's not how meditation has to be. I actually have found it more useful as a way to take time to think about something deeply and personally, because I am the kind of person who, surprise, surprise, likes to intellectualize my feelings, maybe a little bit too much. And I think because I'm used to these mental health conditions, which had me feeling things that were like nonsensical, it's been hard to trust my emotions. And so putting them in this separate space mentally felt a lot like relief. But I think it took me a while to appreciate that sometimes there are feelings and stresses that aren't driven by these dysfunctions in my mind, that change or loss or burnout is something that you can't necessarily dismiss as the product of your weird chemical imbalances, and that you probably should sit with those feelings, in a feeling kind of way. For me, that is more where meditation has been helpful to allow me to, and I cannot believe I'm about to use this phrase unironically on the internet, honor those real feelings and think about them in a way that isn't just pure distance logic.
You and the mountain, in all of its stillness and majesty, become one. You become the mountain.
So Headspace is a mental health guide app which includes meditations, but also like podcasts, mini activities, and more. And you basically decide the style of exercise or audio that works for you. You can choose how often you want to use it, what areas of your life you want to focus on. And those might be everyday worries or help with like a specific life event. And they have stuff for everything from like work and parenting stresses to productivity guidance to like more nebulous, overwhelming feelings of like loss or loneliness or powerlessness. A lot of people talk about meditation like it's this Zen vibes, feeling of being at peace with the world kind of thing. But for me, it's more finding other ways to experience and process and visualize emotions and struggles as part of like an overall mental health care, like giving you ways to explain something to your therapist at your next session, or like as a technique to utilize in a moment of acute stress, but like alongside things like medication or other treatments as well. So yeah, if you can relate to my feelings about feelings and want to give something like this a try, then you can try out Headspace completely free for 60 days, see if it's for you. All you have to do to sign up is go to my link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen. Okay, back to the video. The compulsions. Obsessions are an element of OCD that get kind of pushed to the side in most representation in place of visual compulsions, hand washing or desk organizing, like I talked about before. Although these compulsions are a direct product of the initial obsessive thoughts, a way to try and alleviate those thoughts as much as possible, we don't necessarily see this link clearly when OCD is portrayed on screen. The link is absolutely there. The key function of compulsions is to alleviate anxiety or distress caused by the obsessions. Compulsions may serve the purpose of neutralizing specific belief-related distress and thereby undoing the obsessions and preventing harm. For example, for those whose compulsions involve washing due to obsessions around bacteria or disease, the washing itself might be enacted in a practical sense to lessen the likelihood of disease. However, this sort of understandable cause and effect relationship isn't always the case. For example, someone might feel the need to create order or symmetry via objects around them to achieve a just right feeling that isn't tied to an easily matched obsession at all. Compulsions are often beyond reason. They aren't necessarily logical and might not relate at all to the issue they're trying to fix and can often go to extremes. Research on compulsions has noted that the reasons for these compulsions and the way that they're done vary widely. For me, every time I fall into one of these thought spirals that people can hear what I'm thinking and then having these intrusive thoughts spew out hatred in my own head, I feel compelled to try and counteract it. For a long time, the compulsions weren't specifically related to the obsessions in any discernible way. I would drown out the thoughts with my own repeated phrases, especially counting and numbers, the number 3 in particular. I would count objects around me in threes, find patterns of threes, do sums in my head for any numbers I found that weren't threes, like an unhinged version of Countdown. I'd glance to the side and see a house number, 472. Well, 4 plus 7 plus 2 is 13, and 1 times 3 is 3. You write 4 with 3 strokes, you write 7 and 2 together as 3 strokes, just constantly over and over, trying to reduce everything to 3. I would fill up my mind with these compulsions that formed a kind of mental barrier in my brain, as if it could protect these other people from hearing any distressing thoughts themselves. Other compulsions have included a lot of counting. As a kid, I would spend the entire 4-hour journey to my grandma's house staring out of the window and counting the street lights in groups of 3. I couldn't allow myself to do anything else, just in case. I've had a few rare external compulsions too, tapping things in threes, not allowing myself to step on cracks, that kind of thing. My obsession and my compulsions were linked by OCD, but not really by any discernible logic. Ironically, it's been linking them that has ended up helping me in my management of the condition the most in the last few years. My anti-anxiety medication has definitely helped, there's no denying that, but so is learning more about OCD, how it manifests, and where the power to cause distress comes from. I've sort of figured out ways to use a condition against itself. Take the obsession with people being able to hear my thoughts. Originally, this would lead to me repeating hours of vigilant, meaningless, compulsion-driven noise in my own head, trying to block my thoughts. But if I say, sure, okay, you're right, OCD, people can totally hear my thoughts, that means that they can see what I really think, beyond your intrusive bullshit. They can see and understand what OCD is and how it manifests as intrusive thoughts that are, by their nature, in opposition to who I am as a person. And I got to the point where I could kind of cut my compulsive thoughts off at an apology to people walking past and give them an invitation into my mind if they want to see what's happening. Because by OCD's own logic, they can hear everything that I'm thinking. I don't need to block them out. They'll understand that the bullshit that's happening in my brain as well as I do. Again, I'm aware that this is not actually happening in reality, but weirdly utilizing the logic of these spirals against themselves has worked surprisingly well. A similar thing happens with object counting now. It takes a lot of mental effort, but sometimes I can close my eyes as I walk or ride in a train or car until I've gone past an undetermined amount of lampposts or cracks and have effectively stopped my OCD brain from being able to accurately count. So the counting becomes pointless in a way. Schrodinger's multiples of 3, I guess. Like, it could be 3, it could not be 3. I simply don't know, and therefore neither do you, and there's actually no box we can open to find out. So the logic then becomes, actually, if you OCD want me to be distressed and uncomfortable, that is still there somewhat at the feeling of an unfinished compulsion, but I don't have to spend all my mental time and energy on it too. I think it's important to note, particularly as we talk about representation moving forwards, that research has shown taking part in the compulsions themselves doesn't bring pleasure to the people doing them, and may offer only limited relief from anxiety for some sufferers. In other words, compulsions are not done out of joy or pleasure, but as a mechanism to try and prevent or circumnavigate the obsessive thoughts and the distress that comes with them. One of the most classic examples of traditional representations of OCD on screen comes from the cursed TV series Glee and the character of Emma Pillsbury. Anyone who is familiar with this show will know this portrayal, with the Bambi-eyed, red-haired, cheerfully polishing individual grapes from her lunchbox in the staff room. Crucially, her compulsions are often shown to us as part of a happy routine. She hums and smiles as she cleans in a way that gives the impression that rather than compulsions being tied to distressing internal thoughts, they're a fun quirk of her personality. During an episode where she finally agrees to see a therapist for the first time, Emma spends the entire 50-minute session cleaning the chair that she's meant to sit in. So by the time she's ready, the session is already over. It's a classic Glee moment of taking something serious and making a joke with it. Until the therapist says the session has ended, we assume that Emma has just quickly polished the chair, so the reveal that it's been almost an hour is this comedic appeal to extremes. But it also follows up in typical Glee fashion by barreling straight into an important lesson around mental health, with the therapist explaining, "It's clear you have a fairly severe case of obsessive compulsive disorder." She then goes on to give the classic very special episode message of it being nothing to be ashamed of, that it's treatable, that some mental health conditions aren't taken as seriously as they should be. Emma ends up taking medication, and this is where we see the boundaries around this type of representation, because Emma is also a classic example of a side character whose mental health issues are molded into whatever shape suits the lead character's storyline the most. She admits that even though she was reluctant at first, the medication is helping her, but it's the start of a scene that's actually about her encouraging main character Will to follow his Broadway dream. Her very real struggle with a lifelong mental illness becomes a plucky message for this guy to work hard and not give up. The nature of a side character means that they are often reduced to the surface level storylines, and if they do get a more focused story, it's often about the one thing that is different about them. Emma's individual existence is largely around her OCD, and the rest is taken up with her role as a love interest. She ends up giving different reasons for her OCD manifesting depending on the episode, making it unclear if the writers forgot that they'd already had to explain it, or that they wanted to retcon earlier backstory reveals, or if Emma was lying the first time around. It gives an audience a sense that potentially it wasn't deemed that important to the show. In the infamous Born This Way episode, where the Glee Club is made to wear t-shirts to help them embrace their perceived flaws, Will pressures Emma to write OCD on hers instead of the ginger that she'd originally wanted to go with. His treatment of Emma's OCD has been criticised in other moments of the show too. One Reddit user with OCD wrote in a thread discussing the show, "One scene that I know was meant to be cute but always made me a little iffy was in season 1 episode 2 where they're cleaning the school and he rubs chalk on her nose. She was very obviously not comfortable with it and he did it anyways, and he's lucky she didn't have a panic attack. I don't like how they romanticize something like that, especially since at that point Will and her were barely even friends, just co-workers who enjoyed each other's company." I think this feeds into the myth around mental health being something that you can love out of someone, or that they should be able to get over it simply because it's what people around them want. That if they really loved you, they'd be able to fight their condition to be with you in the way that you want them to be. Other side or guest characters with OCD in different shows have received, I would say, better treatment than Emma. One of the most memorable perhaps being a brief appearance by Michael J. Fox in Scrubs. Scrubs was a medical comedy show that aired in the 2000s. In 2004, there was a 2-episode arc that guest starred Michael J. Fox as Dr. Casey, a professor visiting the hospital who also happens to have OCD. Initially, the show's lead JD is in awe of Casey, because he's both a medical attending and a surgeon, giving him 2 specialities and earning him the nickname Super Doc in JD's narration. The first time he appears on the show, in fact, Casey strides into the hospital to much internal fanfare in JD's voiceover, but he immediately has to leave and re-enter multiple times till he gets it just right. Unlike the cheery disposition of Emma in Glee, Casey is clearly frustrated by this outcome. We get the sense of him having a deep experience of OCD internally, with an impact that the lead character JD doesn't see or appreciate at first. This is only a small guest star appearance, but it manages to give us a sense of his internal struggle with his obsessions and compulsions, letting us know that the quirky behaviours that JD and the others see are just the surface. He's actually working hard to keep them acceptable in public. The show often blends blends a silly humour and fantasy sequences with the more poignant moments that fit with the stakes of a hospital setting. One of the most well-known scenes from the show that does just this sees Dr. Casey unable to leave the OR after an operation because he continues to wash his hands over and over again. Unlike the confident and competent figure that JD has come to see through the rest of the episode, this is a moment of Casey unable to hide just how disruptive and upsetting his OCD can be. Casey turns off the sink and goes for a towel, then stomps his foot in frustration. Damn it! Lada's cool too. I'm sorry, look, I spent the last few days meeting new people and trying to get used to this place, and I'm stressed and I'm tired. He leans his head against the window. And I just want to go home. But here's the punchline. Even though my last surgery was 2 hours ago, I can't stop washing my damn hands. He heads back to the sink, soaping up again. Ugh! He shakes his hands angrily, splashing soapy water around. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. Look, this is a weak moment. Nobody's supposed to see this. And mark my words, I'll clean up the soap. Probably several thousand times. To many viewers, this was a different take on the notable OCD representation of the past, written off as being a neat freak or merely a personality quirk or preference. That line, nobody's supposed to see this, speaks volumes to me. It shows a doctor, the model of intellectual prowess, well liked and respected by his peers, in a state of anger, humiliation, and fear. It's not that he wants to be doing this, that he gets a satisfaction, thought of a nice, clean OR. It's something that brings him shame, but is uncontrollable in that moment. The show also gives us a view of compulsions, which are separate from contamination-specific obsessions. Not just his re-entry into the hospital at the start, but his habit of binking everything in a patient's room before he can start his day. Or a scene in a bar where between every sip, he has to put a new drinks mat on top of the bottle, and then at the end of the scene, the latest mat falls off and he says, I'm going to need another beer, to the bartender. These are more like the nonsensical rituals and reasonings that many people with OCD deal with. Some of them take you out of the moment, overwhelming your thoughts and actions, but others you can do while holding a conversation or doing another activity, because you've been forced to run your internal OCD life alongside your everyday life too since you first started suffering from it. The end of each of these 2 episodes, without context, might be seen to fall a little bit into the misery or inspiration porn that plagues many portrayals of mental illness and disability on screen. Everyone else learns a valuable lesson from the poor suffering afflicted character about life or love or something. In the first episode, after seeing Dr. Casey in the OR, JD ruminates on how seeing this man that he was about to berate for some insignificant reason, suffering with his own shit, maybe he should put concerns that he and his friends have been struggling with into some perspective. However, Scrubs does this every episode with all types of characters and scenarios. JD's whole thing is learning a lesson every episode about empathy or reevaluating something he's assumed or believed. The fact that it's a character with OCD this time isn't some problematic exception to me. In that first episode, yeah, he learns it by seeing the genuine struggles of someone with OCD, but in the second episode, that lesson comes for another character, Elliot, as she finds out before he was called away from their hospital to another job that Casey had a small but significant victory against his obsessions. Casey decided earlier that episode that a toilet on the roof of the hospital would be his Everest, determined to sit on it at least once to prove to himself that he could do it. Towards the end of the episode, Elliot, who has been struggling with self-confidence, specifically her ability to perform an intubation, finds a selfie of him on the toilet with "your turn" written on the back for her. It's clear in the show's framing that this isn't a character being seen as an inspiration for simply living his life with OCD. It was a specific goal within the context of his recovery, and it's treated as seriously as a show can treat a roof toilet. It's also important to note that Casey is not magically cured over these 2 episodes. Even though he managed to sit on the toilet, afterwards he's still exiting and re-entering the hospital as he tries to leave for his new job. The experience of OCD is rarely linear, and it feels fitting that over these 2 episodes, the portrayal of Casey's condition includes highs and lows too. The causes? We know that OCD is associated with particular abnormalities in the brain, in particular hyperactivity in a set of brain regions known as the basal ganglia, the anterior thalamus, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the orbitofrontal cortex. But that isn't the whole story. It's not only the physical brain structure that determines if someone is more prone to developing OCD, because OCD is, at the same time, a psychological condition that is influenced by life experience. Yale School of Medicine points out that they aren't really sure what comes first, the core brain abnormality which leads to OCD symptoms, or whether the obsessions and compulsions developing over time are reflected in brain function. They note, The answer is probably both. Underlying genetic and other biological factors probably set the stage and determine why one person is more at risk than another for developing OCD, but life experiences may then contribute to who develops the disorder and who does not, and to what form their symptoms take. It's been linked to genetic factors, brain formation, other mental health concerns, natural personality and temperament, and trauma. In truth, it's most likely a combination of factors that differs from person to person, but those differences, I think, can speak to something I see often in audiences who are unused to realistic portrayals of their experiences. Sometimes information about OCD is so sparse that even people who have it are misinformed, or extrapolate their own experiences as universal for the condition. While researching for this video, I found a fascinating example of this in action. For each of the pieces of representation that I looked into, I also searched for reviews and commentary from other OCD sufferers, and this led me to numerous Reddit threads about the character of Dr. Bailey in the long-running medical drama Grey's Anatomy. Bailey's OCD appears to manifest from recent trauma in season 10, where her compulsions interfere directly with a surgery, causing her to undertake unnecessary procedures on that patient. At this point, she hasn't been diagnosed, and is in fact seemingly in denial of the problem, but a couple of episodes later, she is tested to see if she is fit to be in surgery. She's asked to perform a simple suture by another doctor, but without exhibiting OCD behaviors, and ultimately fails. This to me is a bit of a missed opportunity, focusing solely on behaviors as the issue, rather than the trauma and obsessions underneath that are the real problem, as if being able to contain the compulsions enough to do your job would make the internal suffering not as much of an issue. Dr. Bailey eventually agrees to treatment, and for the most part, the storyline sort of fades away, but for some references in later seasons from what I understand. But when you look at discussions online from viewers with OCD about the handling of the storyline, something interesting emerges. Some people are specifically critical of the idea that her OCD comes out of nowhere, in that it doesn't seem to have been with her throughout the rest of her life. The argument they make is essentially that this is bad representation because OCD is something that you are born with. Others, who are clearly fans of the show and character, but still believe that OCD is not something that can develop later in life, pull out examples of moments from previous seasons that seem to prove OCD tendencies have always existed in the character. When Tuck got hurt in season 4, I'm rewatching it just now, and I realised she definitely has OCD tendencies. She asks Tucker to explain what happened multiple times, and goes over it multiple times on whether she closed the gate or not. It was an example of people using their own experiences to bias the reading of the character one way or another. Because in reality, OCD isn't necessarily a condition that you have from birth, that will have evidence spottable since childhood. But it's clear that the people commenting this kind of thing had had that experience and had assumed that it was like that for everyone. Sometimes, however, personal experiences can lead to leaps forward in representation. I talked at the start of this video about the prevalence of contamination OCD, as the way TV and film keeps an inaccurate and palatable image of OCD in the public consciousness. But a new movie, Turtles All the Way Down, based on the book by John Green, has shown how this type of OCD can absolutely be a source of real and meaningful representation. It's a film that shows us the reality behind the sanitized image of contamination OCD itself, pulling from Green's own experiences, and having a director who takes advantage of the tools of audiovisual storytelling to further representation, rather than hamper it. From the very start of the film, we're immersed in first-person narration, as our main character, Asa, explains the way that she sees the world and how her internal obsessions manifest, at first to a therapist, but also to us as an audience. She talks about the idea that we are full of microorganisms, that our bodies are 50% made up of these other creatures, about how out of control and unreal that makes her feel. We also find out that she has a wound on her finger that she compulsively reopens as a way of quietening these obsessive thoughts, in an act of essentially self-harm, reassuring herself that if she reopens, washes and redresses the wound, she can ensure that it doesn't get infected. This provides, for many people watching, a new view of this type of OCD. This isn't a girl cheerfully polishing a classroom chair before sitting in it, or expressing her controlling personality by lining up her paintbrushes in the art room at school. This is a girl who is suffering, whose thoughts are causing extreme distress, and leading to extreme actions that she can't control. We also have the use of imagery, editing and sound around to create the experience of intrusive thoughts on screen by making them intrusive to the audience. Flashes of wriggling microbes and white noise buzzing cuts us off from the world around Aza. We struggle to hear the conversations around her or to concentrate on the scene in front of her because we, like her, cannot stop this spiral in front of us. We're encouraged by the images on screen and the repetitive monologue in Aza's voice, reminding her of these millions of germs, of the types of infection that she could get, everything around her being ready to cause infection, to experience the sense of discomfort and disgust alongside her. The film works hard to give us the same feeling of visceral disgust that Aza is experiencing from just living her life. There's some interesting pronoun usage too. Her thoughts, whether intrusive or not, are all in her own voice, and she flits between referring to herself as you and I. She says she has a fever, then counters by telling herself, stop it, you don't have a fever, before her voice pipes up, you don't have a fever yet. OCD is such a strange condition because it's part of you, of your brain, of your psychology, but it's also not you at the same time. It's inside of you, but it causes nothing but distress and pain. It has your voice, but not your intention or consent to use it. In the film, this creates a parallel thematic tension. Aza's experience with OCD in her head is comparable to her relationship with the microbes inside of her body. They are part of her, and they aren't. She finds it impossible to figure out who she is without them, whether she even exists at all underneath. This is such an interesting choice to me, to have the intrusive thoughts indistinguishable from her own vocally, but to also show us the conflict between them and how she wants to be thinking. She understands logically the bacteria and infections are a thing, but she's unable to contradict the OCD-driven thoughts when they take leaps of logic to panic and upset her. But we also see how exhausting it is for her, that it isn't a battle that she can withstand forever, and that allows for a lack of judgment when she finally succumbs to her compulsions. As soon as she rewraps her finger, the voices stop, the noise cuts off, and we have a sudden silence to mimic the relief that compulsions can give. Unlike many of the previous moments of OCD representation, Aza is our main protagonist, who is explicitly said to have the condition rather than just being coded that way, and the distressing internal experience isn't ignored or downplayed. She tells her therapist that she would kill to be normal. It affects her friendships, the possibility of romance, and a life she wants with family, kids, and stable mental health. We also get to see how those around her deal with her condition. Her late father, she tells her therapist, understood her more than her mum. He made her feel less crazy, telling her, "You're right to worry. Life is worrisome." This was such an interesting scene for me because OCD is one of those conditions where validating that what someone is worried about is real and understandable as a source of worry is sometimes the worst thing you can do for them. It's great to not feel judged, but when you actually are kind of crazy, then being told what you think is normal is not actually that helpful. We see in the film, as Aza refuses to take her medication, even as her symptoms worsen, how she finds it hard to move beyond this state as the version of herself that her dad supported. In contrast, her mum is portrayed within the archetype of the worrying, over-involved mother, which in this scenario is 100% understandable. She is herself overwhelmed with anxiety around her daughter's well-being and her own performance as a mother. Towards the end of the film, her mum calls her therapist to tell her about Aza's deteriorating mental health and pleads with her daughter, please don't be mad at me when she finds out. I think many of us with friends who suffer with mental illness who get to a crisis point before they're able to independently decide to get help themselves feel that fear deeply. The idea that in trying to save them, you might push them away, questioning if it's better to say nothing but still be able to be there for them yourself. But the film also delves into the messiness of these relationships, how it isn't a case of black and white, vault and morality when it comes to it. One of the things that I admired most about this film was the way that part of its commitment to portraying OCD in a complex and realistic light was also showing how it can affect those around you. I think the idea that the person with OCD is the most affected and that it can have a negative impact on their friends, partners, family and relationships too are ideas that can and should coexist. From the start of the movie, it's clear that Aza's best friend Daisy knows about her OCD, can recognize signs of a spiral, is aware of the boundaries and rules that Aza's mind wants to implement, but is even willing to push back on them. When Aza insists, "You know you're not allowed to drink non-clear liquids in Harold," her car, Daisy counters, "It's vanilla, it's clear adjacent." And it kind of comes off as a great relationship from that initial point of view. There's a seeming honesty there, right? But towards the end of the film, Aza finally reads Daisy's passion project fan fiction for the first time and realizes that there's a character based on her in there. This character has clearly become a place for Daisy to vent her frustrations with Aza and their friendship. In extracts from the fic, we hear the character described as, "My best friend and my greatest burden. All her habits were nervous. She wasn't a bad person, just a useless one. Aza confronts Daisy, and because we've been watching the film from Aza's point of view, we assume that this exchange will be one where Daisy is exposed as a bad friend. We've seen Aza's inner turmoil, seen her struggles, been privy to her intrusive thoughts. What right does Daisy have to complain? At first, the script seems to double down on this. Daisy says that she and one of their other friends have talked about Aza and they realise that she's like mustard. You're awesome in small quantities, but a lot of you is a lot. Immediately, we see how much this hurts Aza, but then we're given Daisy's perspective, that there is a self-centeredness to Aza's behaviour in their friendship. She asks a series of questions that a typical high school friend should know, let alone a best friend that you spend all your time with. What are my parents' names? What are their jobs? What's my middle name? Do I have any pets? Aza can't answer. Daisy continues to tell her about how much it hurts that Aza doesn't see or appreciate things like the economic differences between them, especially when Aza judges her for it. This confrontation gives the situation far more nuance we might be used to seeing in these narratives. This isn't a case of one bad and one good person. This is two people who each have their own struggles and perspectives that sometimes come into conflict. There's an element of self-centeredness to OCD itself that manifests in the person it affects through no fault of their own. Your intrusive thoughts are often the loudest voice in the room. You can be distracted from conversations by obsessions in your own mind. But there is a suggestion here that Aza has gotten so used to this state of being that even when she's in a place to engage meaningfully with others, it isn't necessarily something that comes naturally to her. But the movie doesn't make this a clear-cut lesson about how Aza is a bad friend and how the most important part of mental illness is how it affects those around you. She tries to explain her side to Daisy too. Imagine being stuck with mustard all the time. These things can all be true at once, that someone can be overwhelmed by their mental illness, but that experience is not more or less valid or difficult than anyone else's. There's a level of accountability that comes along with any difficulty in your life, whether external or internal. That part of working on and through your mental health issues is examining not just what it's putting you through, but what it's doing to those around you, and also how far that effect is under your control, even in small ways. Daisy's complaints were not something that Aza was aware of, but trying to work on or had communicated that she was sorry about already. She genuinely hadn't seen the hurt that she was causing. In romance movie plots, the structure of the narrative is almost always the same. This isn't a bad thing, it's actually one of the things that makes them so satisfying. What's interesting about Turtles is that it imposes the traditional romance structure onto Aza and Daisy's relationship. We get the second into third act breakup, the grand gesture reconciliation, after the lead has worked through what they needed to discover or change about themselves. At the end of the film, we have that friendship reconciliation instead, as Aza pushes herself to attend an art show that Daisy had invited her to earlier in the movie. The final scene of the film is the both of them talking, with Aza asking Daisy if she thinks that she'll ever be able to be with someone. Daisy replies, and a monologue of dreamy vignettes plays over the words, Aza alongside a potential future partner. I think you, Aza Holmes, will have a very full life. I think you'll go to college and study whatever you want, and have a career, one that you're proud of. And I think you will be with someone great. I think you'll have an incredible love story. I even think you'll have a family of your own someday. You're going to make a whole damn life for yourself. I know it. This speech up until this point is the kind of sweet, sentimental, encouraging messaging we so often see around mental health conditions. Yeah, sure, you'll find someone and have kids and go to college and do all the things this whole movie has been proving that you're struggling acutely with on a fundamental level and haven't yet been able to attain. But then she continues, but I don't want to lie to you. I think it will be hard sometimes. I think sometimes you'll see that life unbuilt, but you'll always rebuild it, and you'll never be alone, I promise. It's this lack of sugarcoating, but also preserving a sense of care and compassion that makes it such an impactful ending for me. In fact, the compassion is in the commitment to the truth, no matter how hard. To only tell Aza everything will be fine would have been to do her a disservice as a friend, and in turn do a disservice to the audience. Although not, I would say, the primary romance story that is between these two friends, Turtles does include a romantic subplot. However, this side plot allows us to see the effects that OCD can have on intimate relationships in a way that matches with the rest of the movie's care in not creating a sugar-coated version of the experience, but not creating misery porn either, for lack of a better term. Aza starts the movie convinced that there is no way that she can enter into a romantic relationship because, as she puts it, swapping bodily fluids is my idea of hell. How can I have a boyfriend if I hate the idea of kissing him? It's this panic at the idea of kissing a boy that she's clearly attracted to because of the idea of the bacteria in his mouth, that they'd be inside of her now, that they would make her sick. But it's not just the physical contamination anxieties. She's also aware that in order to have a meaningful relationship, she needs to engage in honesty, trust, and intimacy, which feels impossible when those intimacies would involve telling someone that you want to see you in a positive light, that you're thinking about wounds and disease and you can't stop. She's aware that the image of romance that she sees everywhere else is that the answer to the question, what are you thinking about, should be you or our future or something funny or inane or deep, not, well, kissing you will make me sick and I'll be infested with bacteria, also maybe we aren't even real. And so when she's reconnecting with her childhood friend from camp, we see her attempt to enact the image of the normal teen girlfriend that she's been told is desirable. She doesn't tell him about her OCD, doesn't communicate about her aversion to kissing, gives him a sanitized version of her inner thoughts. She talks about fish parasites and he says, I like the way your brain works. Now at this point, I trusted this movie, but if this had been in a lesser kind of OCD representation, this would have been an immediate red flag for me that this was a direction that the show or the movie was going to go in, where OCD would be seen as this like quirky thing that he really appreciates about her for being different, and that's how you know that they were made for each other. Like he finds out about her OCD later in the movie and then claims to still love the way her mind works, and it sounds like romantic for a second on the surface, and you think about it for one moment and it's like, actually not that good of a thing to celebrate that she is mentally suffering because of this amazing mind of hers. But by now, I think it's clear that this movie is not going to go down the mental illness as a superpower nonsense route. So what we get is a more complex journey. Asa has a kind of epiphany after getting to talk to a professor whose thoughts on philosophical questions have resonated with her for years. Asa confesses some of the roots of her OCD feelings, things that tie in with typical human and especially teenage topics of existential dread and free will and sense of self, and the professor reassures her that these doubts make her more real, not less, ending the brief meeting with a sentiment that Asa would fit in really well at the college. This spurs Asa to joyfully run into her boyfriend's arms for a kiss. It's a moment of spontaneity that many lesser movies would have left as the film's climax, showing the power of love conquering all. Instead, she has a panicked relapse almost immediately, where even her usual band-aid compulsions don't work, and she ends up escalating her compulsions to eating soap to counteract the thoughts of bacteria inside of her. On a day after this crisis point, she admits that she thought she would be better now. She's gone through this recovery treatment and it almost feels like it should be the narrative reward for that. But she isn't better enough to kiss him, and that ends up not being enough for him, and they break up. Romance cannot save her. It's not enough to cure her. It can't realistically be part of her recovery or treatment in a meaningful way because it's conditional. She needs something solid within herself to ground this in, informed and motivated by the kind of person that she wants to be and the life that she wants to live. The treatment she's gone through happens after a crisis point in her OCD, after she's in a car accident and is made to stay in hospital. She struggles with the idea of being in a space that is so triggering for obsessive thoughts. Even as she's being told that she's seriously injured, that her liver is bleeding, she can't be discharged for her own safety, she's screaming and crying trying to leave the hospital, thinking about all of the potential diseases and germs that she could be exposed to there. During her stay, the intrusive thoughts only grow, culminating in a scene where she begins eating soap again but can't seem to stop, as even this extreme compulsion cannot silence her thoughts at this point. They have to pump the soap out of her stomach and remove the dispensers from her hospital room for her own safety. I think people who have been used to the typical ideas of OCD representation and rhetoric might look at this as an example exaggerated for dramatic effect, a bit of artistic license. Where's the cheerful arranging of pencils or the eye-rollingly uptight woman re-cleaning something her silly husband hasn't polished properly to the laughter of a studio audience? But these scenes to me really got across the crux of the OCD experience, that is the inner turmoil and suffering. Compulsions are most often not logical and can actually be harmful, and they don't go away because some other crisis has emerged, like a nasty car crash. In fact, it might well exacerbate their symptoms. OCD shaming on social media. In the widespread shaming of those talking openly about OCD online, I think we can see the reasons why we haven't seen a more expansive exploration of the disorder in film and TV. The internet has long been a place for people to share common experiences, often in private spaces like one-to-one or group messages or locked forums or servers. But we've also seen those with experiences or identities which haven't gotten past mainstream gatekeepers tell their own stories, from queer creators in the early days of YouTube showing young people what their lives could look like during a time when we were fighting very publicly for equal rights, to overtly emotional story times about dealing with depression or anxiety on TikTok. But experiences of OCD were something I hadn't seen enter a widespread audience until fairly recently, ironically because of a TikTok trend that, for lack of a better word, appropriated the language of the disorder. Letting your intrusive thoughts win became a meme, characterizing intrusive thoughts as spontaneous, silly, zany thoughts that you would let win in order to do that thing on camera. A lot of these videos were things like cutting your own hair instead of going to a hairdresser, or stealing something from your friend's plate that looked really good in a restaurant. So not intrusive thoughts at all. These are, I guess, impulsive thoughts, things that pop into anyone's brain, maybe as an impulse driven by base desires like hunger, or because of the pop of adrenaline at the thought of doing something random or unexpected, but not actually dangerous or morally questionable. There were a handful of these thoughts people talked about that did stray more into the dangerous or the violent, things like I could just jump in front of a train, or I could just swing the wheel of my car and plow into pedestrians, but it was an impulsive thought in that they could easily clear it away. And so as a response to this, users with OCD began stitching these videos or making their own, bringing attention to why there is a difference between what these TikToks have been portraying and actual intrusive thoughts. That there is also something specifically harmful about portraying intrusive thoughts as something you give into, as if it's just a matter of willpower, that if you let them control you, in a way it's a sign of weakness, it's your fault. But some users with OCD themselves went a step further, being open and specific about their intrusive thoughts, including those that are genuinely taboo. They made TikToks that shared the way that their intrusive thoughts manifested, as telling them they wanted to hurt their children, or shout vile abuse at people in the street, or crash their cars into oncoming traffic. And the response to this openness included a lot of hostility. People asking why the hell they would share this. I can't believe you'd admit this publicly. That someone should check on their families, or that they should be locked away. This has always been a risk of confiding in others about these obsessive thoughts, but there's something in the rise of moral panic discourse that feeds in here as well, I think. There's this implication in a lot of these spaces that you are what you think, that your private thoughts themselves can be seen as red flags. So to think something at all is seen as tantamount to doing it, which is the same as acting upon it. That unless you keep your mind morally pure, you are a bad person. That impact matters more than intention, but only if you've done a bad thing. For a lot of people reacting with disgust at hearing about actual intrusive thoughts, they're doing so because of a lack of understanding and education. Thoughts have nothing to do with them, have no actual impact on them, but they make them feel uncomfortable and threatened because they are not an experience that they can relate to in any way. Depression isn't just being sad, and anxiety isn't just being worried, but I think that they're somewhat easier for some people to understand because these are pretty universal points of reference, however simplistic. But things like intrusive thoughts or psychosis or hallucinations that manifest in less accepted mental health disorders don't have a real equivalent in a healthy mind. There isn't an everyday relatable version of inescapable thoughts that force you into unwanted action. So mentally healthy people looking at OCD from the outside may well see either something so alien as to be frightening, or something that feels like it should be easy to fight because they have random impulsive thoughts and they simply stop thinking them. They haven't had the experience of being out of control of their own brain. But there is something sticky here, a nuance that means that this isn't just the fight for OCD representation and understanding versus ignorant outsiders. And that is the nature of many intrusive thoughts being tied to morality. To talk about the subject of your intrusive thoughts is often to touch upon a pain that other people have a very real experience of. Admitting to thoughts of harming a child publicly online, even though those thoughts torture you internally, may well be triggering for those with childhood abuse trauma themselves, or whose children have been harmed by others. But voicing those thoughts may well make other sufferers from the same form of OCD feel less terrified, ashamed, and alone. and help those around the OCD sufferer understand them better too. One particular TikTok video which ended up spreading across the platform is a perfect example of this. The initial user made a video with text that read, "I have intrusive thoughts that I'm racist because I have OCD and it attacks my moral beliefs and values." I'm not going to put any of the videos here or show usernames or anything because this was early last year and clearly difficult for everyone who weighed in, and I don't want anyone going over and restarting this stuff. But I did want to list out a range of perspectives that were given by a variety of users who had stitched or commented or duetted this video. That acknowledging that these were intrusive thoughts that you had, even with no details, was irresponsible and harmful to people of colour who might see the video. That anyone with thoughts that were taboo should not be talking about having them online, in public, where anyone could see and be affected by the thought of someone having these thoughts. That this was a useful piece of awareness raising that could help destigmatise mental health disorders, and that by not being specific or graphic about the thoughts themselves, it was simply factual information. That the shock of seeing someone admit to racist thoughts had caused uninformed backlash from people not realizing that OCD manifests these thoughts in people who do not naturally have them, as it specifically attacks their real moral beliefs. That this backlash creates a particularly difficult environment for people of color who themselves have OCD, who may be unsure if those criticizing this specific type of intrusive thought would also reject them for their own obsessive thoughts, whether race-related or not. This last point feels particularly worrying if we look at the sparse amount of research around Black Americans with OCD, which points to them being less likely to receive treatment or experience remission than their white counterparts. We can see the same prevalence of intrusive thoughts being linked to social taboos and opposition to immorality when we look at the outcomes of research on OCD manifestations in the same demographic. The International OCD Foundation Guidelines for Therapists working with African American sufferers pointing out that an increased prevalence of obsessions centered around violent thoughts, sexuality, and cleanliness may occur. They emphasize that this leaning may well stem from historical and current stereotypes and labels placed on Black people in America, that they are overly sexualized, seen as violent. To an OCD mind, this nonsensical racist rhetoric becomes something that you can't stop thinking about yourself. In a piece for OCD Action, mental health advocate Sean Flores wrote about his experiences of OCD as a Black man in the UK. "OCD has taken me to some incredibly dark places. I didn't even know I had OCD when I was at my lowest. I don't want anybody else to feel as isolated and scared as I did. That's why I'm so passionate about raising awareness, so people know that OCD is serious, so they understand what symptoms to look out for, and so they know that with the right support, it can get better. When OCD first showed up in my life, I initially struggled with obsessive thoughts about my sexuality, which I wrestled with constantly. My OCD then quickly moved on to harm, in particular sexual assault. The thought of rape popped into my head all the time. When I was in the depths of my OCD, I could never have imagined admitting to having those thoughts." He's spoken about how he grew up in a Christian fundamentalist environment and so internalized a lot of negative ideas about being gay from a young age. For some people who've experienced sexuality OCD, it can come from this internalized homophobia, the feeling that being gay is something wrong, something that to even think about yourself is distressing. For others, it's more about a fear of not knowing who you truly are. If you can doubt something as fundamental as your sexuality, then how do you know anything about yourself? And for others, it's more complex still, that they know OCD is often focused on stuff that you fear, and so intrusive thoughts of being gay might not themselves cause distress, but the idea that they are secretly homophobic because their OCD is picking up on some hidden fear of being gay can. For some queer people, coming across someone like Sean talking openly about a deep, distressing fear of being gay like them, it would be painful in itself. Sean's truth, which may well help more people seek treatment as they realise that they aren't alone, could also enforce the idea that homophobia is alive and well to those who come across his advocacy work without context, particularly homophobia within the Black community. To me, it's clear looking at this web of differing opinions and experiences that this is a type of situation that we are ill prepared to deal with in a world where we're encouraged to talk about mental health but not told how, where we're encouraged to listen to people but are not given support in how to respond. Sometimes people's experiences of marginalization, suffering, and trauma do not match up neatly with other people's. Sometimes making space more accessible for one person makes it less accessible for others. It's a part of community building that is difficult to navigate in contained real-life spaces, but on the internet, particularly TikTok, which feeds people content on topics that they haven't even sought out, it feels pretty impossible. I honestly don't know that there is a solution here that is going to satisfy everyone right now. It feels like trigger or content warnings like the ones at the top of my video are an option so people can decide to engage or not, but these are the kind of questions we need to be asking to bring conversations beyond the surface level, just open up and talk about it, advice that we get from mainstream mental health campaigns. I recently read an interview with John Green about his new movie where he was asked what he hoped the film might do to move representation of OCD forwards, and he replied, "I hope it makes people who are struggling with psychic pain feel less alone and less stigmatized, because it can be quite a stigmatizing thing. I've been able to lead a really good and full life, which I have, even though I also have these struggles, because I have wonderful friends who lift me up and I'm able to lift up. I hope that people take away from the movie that our connections to each other are really what allow us to sustain ourselves." I think if we're looking at what the future of OCD representation looks like, then we're also looking to what the future of destigmatization and awareness looks like. And to my mind, it shouldn't be a task given solely to the sufferers. I think that people without OCD or without other lesser understood or emphasized mental health conditions need to be engaging with the reality of these conditions. If you're someone watching this video who doesn't have OCD but was just interested to learn, I encourage you to sit with any discomfort that you felt about the things that I talked about today. Unpack what it is that might feel icky or weird or immoral about aspects of the OCD experience. Because what I've just been talking about, I think, ties in with John's words. His hopeful message of connections with other people being what can buoy us, but only if we're also acknowledging and working through our potential clashing needs. I've lived with this condition for over 30 years. I've passed the point of surface level information sharing. I want us to be having conversations that go beyond, here's an individual who washes their hands too much, it's OCD, but that's not the full story. The idea that we should destigmatize, just talk about it, open up, needs to be accompanied by so many other tools. Things like healthcare, social benefits, disability grants, of course, but also support for everyone in these conversations. An understanding of empathy that extends to all involved, that prepares you with a foundation solid enough to come into these talks with friends or colleagues or family without judgment. We need to be having larger conversations about how we live with each other, and what destigmatizing actually looks like in reality, and what steps might come afterwards. Because it isn't just about individuals going, that must be hard, but I accept you. It's intimately tied to concepts of social support, mutual aid, solidarity, blame and intention, impact and justice, creating spaces in which everyone can have room to exist and communicate. The vocal compulsions of an OCD sufferer might clash with the oral sensitivity of an autistic person. The tics of someone with Tourette's may include homophobic slurs in a community space that will emotionally affect queer people there too. Discussing personal responses to trauma that expand beyond the image of the perfect victim may well be too much for a partner with PTSD themselves. These differences in needs have always been here, but with an increase in awareness and more open conversations around things like mental health, neurodiversity, and marginalization in recent years, we're now being given an opportunity to figure out ways to balance the needs of everyone we're in community with. And I think every one of us, whether we literally run a social public space of some kind or just host friends for an occasional book club meetup, can start opening up more real and genuine conversations about accessibility and community, which go beyond a lack of stigma and into a space of true trust and belonging. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you would like to help support me make videos like this one, then I will also leave a link to my Patreon in the description, along with all my social media links, so you can find me all over the internet. And until I see you next time, bye.